Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books, out loud. This is a Little Blue book. It just happens to be Little Blue book number 466, and it is titled A History of Sculpture. And it is written by Murray Sheehan, M.A. Copyright 1924. Now this will be part 5, and we left off near the bottom of page 39 with a new chapter called The French Renaissance. By the 15th century, Gothic architecture and sculpture had both reached a point of over-elaboration and conscious cleverness which lacked the hardy directness of earlier work. Proximity to Italy made it easy for the growing Italian tendencies to spread north, where France used them according to her own lights, either by blending them with her own Gothic elements or by attempting to develop pure classic decorations, landscapes in low relief, or figures in the round. Numerous Italian artists voyaged northward, notably Benvenuto Cellini, during the 15th and 16th centuries. And when we add to this the fact of the wars, waged by the French on Italian soil, and the two Florentine princesses, Maria and Catherine de' Medici, who became French queens, we can understand that for the French, the Renaissance in its earlier phases meant almost wholly an Italianization. The antique hardly entered into it at all, except at second hand, through the instrumentality of the Italians. I'm going to pause this. We must not forget the truly beautiful late Gothic work that was done in France, even as late as the middle of the 16th century. That marvelous choir screen at Chartres, with its stone fretwork like lace and its mirrored figures, with the folds of their garments showing the growing influence of Italian sculpture, was only finished in 1542. Throughout France, we find this same curious mingling of the two elements, long after Italy had entered heartily into the new movement. Although the French retained a large share of their independence, even in the face of waxing Italian artistic supremacy, it is interesting to note here once more that while the arms of our country were triumphing over a weaker land, the culture of that conquered nation was overwhelming the civilization of the conquerors. Francis I of France was largely triumphant with his armies on Italian soil, but he went home a hopeless captive to Italian art and civilization. We have only to remember Shakespeare's attitude toward Italy to realize also the predominance of all things Italian in England in the latter part of the 16th century. Two names alone stand out for us in the early Renaissance sculpture of France in the 16th century. Jean Girodon, died about 1566, is best known perhaps for his graceful water nymphs, now incorporated in the Fountain of the Innocents at Paris. They are carved in a low relief that shows the distinctly 16th century Italian influence, with its conscious ability to render delicate surfaces and to arrange the folds of the garments according to the most flowing lines of easy grace. There is nothing naive or natural or direct here. Everything is patently a developed art, fully aware of its cultural superiority. Gothic art was an affair of the people. This carving is essentially aristocratic, and therein it is essentially of the French Renaissance, which centered always about the court and the homes of the titled and wealthy. Girodon's Diana with the stag and masterly caryatides, all in the Louvre Museum, show his power in figures carved in the round, but particularly he worked in low relief. Germain Pilon, 1535 to 1590. The other figure of this period of France, created only in full figures, of which most generally known are the three Graces, supporting the urn holding the heart of Henry II. Here again we have the same conscious and aristocratic art manifesting itself, The tomb of the same king and his queen, Catherine de' Medici, at Saint Denis near Paris, shows his exquisite delicacy both in the semi-nude recumbent figures and in the kneeling figure. The German Renaissance. In a sense, it is incorrect to speak of the German Renaissance before the 16th century, if by that term we mean the classical or Italian influence. The Germans have been ever a serious-minded people, more concerned with morality than with a more aesthetic conception of beauty, and this fact was evident in their development of Gothic sculpture and in their long clinging to its rigorous style. The late 16th century saw a brief welling up of Italian feeling, but the first half of the 17th century was wrecked by the 30 Years' War and its subsequent poverty both of spirit and of purse. The rise of Protestantism itself had an evil effect upon sculpture, as always, since it spurned carved figures as smacking of the old idolatry. Just as the early Christian fathers had feared them as being too much like heathen idols, and when finally in the latter half of the 17th century the breath of the Renaissance was allowed to blow over Germany, it came from France, like so much German culture at that time, and thus the Germans had missed the fine liberalizing spirit of the early Italian Renaissance, just as they had missed centuries before the humanizing influence of the Romans. But even if German Gothic was not slowly merged into the new and classical sense of realism which we call the Renaissance, along with Italy and France, she produced some excellent works in sculpture during the 15th century, in stone, in wood, and in bronze. Nuremberg, Germany's Athens or Florence. Nuremberg, Germany's Athens or Florence. The genial city, redolent with memories of Hans Sachs and Albert Dürer, who both came at the end of the 15th century, was the chief center of activity in sculpture and of her artisans. We can here mention three of being most noteworthy in the three materials named above. Veit Stoss, 1440 to 1533, was a charming carver in wood. Nowhere, perhaps, was his craft carried to a further development than in southern Germany, where it is still practiced, as in the old days of Nuremberg, Munich, and Oberhammergau. The Renaissance shows itself in the work of Stoss only in a certain developed sense of balanced symmetry, most of the details being still distinctly Gothic. His masterpiece is an elaborate piece of hanging carving in the Lorchenzirke at Nuremberg, depicting the Annunciation, with a wreath of roses surrounding the angel and the Virgin, and carrying medallions from the life of the Virgin. Adam Kraft, about 1450 to 1508, worked in stone and seems never to have left his native city. His carvings are distributed in and about the various churches of Nuremberg, his finest being an ornate tabernacle of Gothic design, no less than 65 feet in height, bristling with pinnacles and carved figures like a Gothic spire. In the same Lorchenzirke as holds this Stoss masterpiece, his work was largely copied in other parts of Germany. Peter Vitscher, V-I-S-C-H-E-R, Vitscher. Peter Vitscher, 1460 to 1529, was a worker in bronze. His great tomb of St. Sebaldus in the Sebaldusserski in Nuremberg is considered his masterpiece, a thoroughly Gothic creation, although the figures show some Italian influence, perhaps through the mediation of Dower. But his most popular statue is the famous figure of King Arthur on the Habsburg tomb in Innsbruck. His heroic depiction of the knight in full armor is one of the most energetic of all. Of all works in bronze, the body is full of life under his carefully wrought panoply, and in its sturdy force reminds one of Donatello's St. George. I'm going to take a drink because I'm cotton mouth. All right. Next chapter. The Flemish Renaissance. The Flemish and Dutch countries at the mouth of the Rhine were in much the same boat as Germany herself as far as the Renaissance was concerned, and in the 15th century were still in the full swing of Gothic sculpture. Protestantism came later to destroy many of their monuments in a fury of iconoclasm, and political unrest sent the sculptors into virtual exile, so that we find these men spreading themselves over France, Germany, Spain, England, and even Italy, where much of the development of French carving must be sought if a consecutive idea of its development is desired. But some notable examples of carving in stone and especially in wood remains on their native soil. The high altar of Notre Dame of Lembek allows us, for instance, to see that as late as the 16th century, an extremely ornate variety of Gothic was still extant. The traceries have much of the feeling of Renaissance arboresques, but they are compounded of Gothic details. The figures are Gothic, but arranged with something of Renaissance balance and grace. In France, in the city of Dijon, capital of Burgundy, and closely affiliated with Flemish influence through the intermarriage of the ruling houses, we find a veritable school of Flemish sculpture in the 14th century, dominated by the genius of Jean de Marville and Klaus Schluter, whose work made of Dijon even today a notable storehouse of Gothic sculpture. England in the 16th century also drew largely on Flemish sources for her sculpture, and even in the 17th and early 18th century, she gained from Holland that Gringling Gibbons for 1648 to 1721, whose wood carving of flowers and fruits in high relief, incorporated in the architectural settings of Sir Christopher Wren, under whom he worked, have come to seem among the most characteristically English of all her sculpture. Pardon me. Spain and Portugal have the same northern countries to thank for much of their sculpture, where the elements of Gothic realism were blended with the southern love of floral ornament. Thus it is that very frequently in Spanish buildings we find a strange remnants of some structure in Holland, with its somewhat squat type of Renaissance decoration. Classic elements had worked north into Holland and then been transported south to Spain. Moorish sculpture, during the centuries in which it held sway over the Spanish peninsula, consisted almost wholly of arabesques and flat decorations, since the Muslim faith prohibits human figures. Because of the bitter hatred towards the invaders, Mohammedan sculpture had very little effect on the native Spanish artists, either in Gothic times or in the Renaissance. The more purely Renaissance style of carving at last reached the lowlands of the 16th century, to give us colored marble choir screens with classic columns and angels, etc. In the midst of Gothic churches, the movement was not wholly inspirational in Scripture, and we need linger here over no single name, although there are some few graceful and elegant figures to be found. Italian Decadence, new chapter. When we left off with Italian sculpture in the 16th century, after Michelangelo, Benedetto Cellini, and Giovanni di Bologna, you remember that it was felt to be the end of great sculpture in Italy. We now have to record a great activity in the 17th century, an overwhelming movement in sculpture, of which we will see traces everywhere in Italy, and by many misguided souls esteemed a manifestation of true art. But compared with the glory that had gone before, and judged by the greatest and most sincere achievements, its sculpture, down the ages, it looms as only a decadent tendency, however popular it may have been in its day. Its guiding genius was Baruni, 1598 to 1680, and from the type of architecture with which it was generally associated, it is called Baroque Sculpture. Sculptors had by this time learned to wield a chisel that could conquer all technical difficulties. Draperies were sent flying in voluminous folds through the air, with a magic lightness never surpassed and never witnessed in nature. Lace was carved in which one could almost count the individual threads, a trick which stirred the wondering admiration of the aesthetically unlettered. Violent emotions were expressed in graceful curves. Hysterical faintings were portrayed to show religious ecstasy. Angels floated on marble clouds. Saccharine delicacy had taken the place of the true manly sweetness of previous generations, and technical ability replaced solid achievement, subordinated to the expression of worthy ideas. Just as in the architecture, every column must now writhe and twist and turn, and every straight line must now be somehow broken into curves and scrolls and Cyrus, so also Scripture had fallen into the hands that were concerned primarily in showing off their own effulgent brilliance. Bernini's Apollo and Daphne is known to everyone, cleverly carved statue that it is, with its slender maidenly form half turning into bark and branches and tender leaves, and its femininely graceful depiction of Apollo. But the carving of laurel leaves and clouds and impossible drapery is not the highest function of sculpture, and the influence of Bernini can only be looked upon as a pernicious one in the development of the art. Oh, pardon me. Next chapter, France in the 17th century. In 17th century sculpture in France, there was, of course, but one dominant influence, and that was Louis XVI. Nothing could remain independent in the presence of that triumphant monarch, who impressed his genius so thoroughly upon every expression of his people that he was virtually the creator of a whole civilization. Earlier in the century, France was under Italian influence in her sculpture, and later the effect of Bernini's art was evident in some of the sculptors. But until the time of Louis, there were no truly noteworthy names aside from some portraitist in a field of endeavor where the French have always been supreme, both in painting and in statuary. Whoever knows the grandiloquent style which reigned at the great palace of Versailles and its elaborate gardens knows what to expect in the sculpture of the period. Girodon, 1628 to 1715, created a series of reliefs, notably the bathing nymphs, in a graceful and flowing style lacking I feel like I have a page there. Lacking in depth of spirit, but pleasing withal, and showing great technical skill. His Rage of Proserpine, also at Versailles, shows the energetic influence of Bernini, while in his Tomb of Cardinal Richelieu in the Church of the Sorbonne at Paris he employs that type of figured allegory which became so prevalent in tomb sculpture. Robert de Lorraine, 1666 to 1743, was his principal pupil and aide at Versailles, and to him we owe the very fine Horses of the Sun on the doorway of the Hotel de Rohan at Paris, which, although it more resembles painting than statuary, archives an excellent decorative effect. Boy, that was hard to read. Koisoveks, 1640 to 1720, excelled in portraits, sometimes done in quasi-classical guise, as in the case of Countess of Burgundy as Diana. The gardens of Versailles teem with his ornate statuary, mostly allegorical, much of it truly magnificent, as befitted the wide sweep of that style of gardening. His two pupils, Nicholas and Guillaume Cousteau, died 1733 and 1746, also created this type of works, notably among them several figures of the rivers of France, and the two spirited horses which now flank the entrance to the Champs-Élysées. Originally intended for Marly, the work of all three at times tended somewhat more to allegory than suits modern taste. Puget, Puget, P-U-G-E-T, 1622 to 1694. Alone among the notable sculptors of this period stands somewhat outside the tradition of Louis XVI, and he spent most of his life in Italy, although his greatest works are now in the Louvre. He fell under the emotional spell of Bernini, which, after all, was not sufficiently suave for Le Roi Soleil, his death of Milo of Croton, his best-known carving, with the lion tearing the flanks of the hero, did not sufficiently show the triumph of man over nature, which was the great ideal of Louis. This must be something sedate and to that extent reposeful about all art to win the suffrage of the grand monarch, and this it was, perhaps, that saved 17th century France from the exaggerated emotionalism of Bernini and held sculpture to a more fitting balance. And I think it will end there for part 5, and we'll come back in part 6 with a new chapter called The 8th Century. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next part.